As the previous couple of speakers have mentioned, we are dangerously close to breaching the Paris Agreement global warming target of 1.5 degrees. We are actually going to reach 1.5 degrees. We're going to hit it sometime around 2030, most likely. So the challenge is how close to 1.5 degrees can we keep global warming? Of course, the science is clear. With every increment of global warming, in particular over 1.5 degrees, we will experience increasingly irreversible impacts and loss and damage, and an increase in the severity and duration and frequency of all extreme weather events. And there's a scientific number called the carbon budget, and that's how, if you like, it's the permissible emissions. It's how much carbon emissions we can have to still limit global warming to about 1.5 degrees. And the number is about 65 billion tonnes of carbon, which is only about 6 years' worth of current emissions. So it follows that every tonne of CO2 counts and must be counted. So as we've heard, if any source of emission, if any globally significant source of emission is not being reported and accounted for, then they're invisible from a policy perspective. So this is the issue. We've heard that the best, I would say, ballpark figure we have for the contribution of military emissions, and as has been pointed out, that does not include the emissions from war and armed conflict and post-war reconstruction, just from military activity. And we know there's somewhere between 1.7 to $2 trillion a year being spent on military every year. That is a very significant amount. So 6% of global emissions, there's about 37.5 billion tonnes of CO2 emitted by humans every year from fossil fuel and deforestation and degradation. So 6% of that is very quick. It's a lot. It's about 2.53 billion tonnes. As we've heard, it's comparable to countries. It's actually about the same as the EU 27 countries, right? So that's how significant it is. And it's more than international aviation shipping emissions, which are somewhere between 3 to 5. So it's likely twice them. So if you think of all the effort the EU is putting into reducing its emissions, all the attention paid on international aviation to bring their emissions somehow under the Paris Agreement, it's absolutely essential, if we're to limit global warming, that military emissions have to be brought in to the equation. So why do we have the problem? Under the Paris Agreement, in fact, under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and the Paris Agreement is an instrument negotiated under the Framework Treaty, the entity that informs parties to the convention, the national governments, on how they report their emissions, which they're obliged to do under the treaty. These are guidelines that are published by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. The IPCC does assessment reports, which come out every 7 years, plus special reports, which synthesize and consolidate and assess all the peer-reviewed research that's done about climate science, how we know the climate's changing and how we project it's going to change, and how we know it's due to human causes, the impacts and risks and vulnerability of human and natural systems to those impacts and risks from climate change, and also mitigation, what it is we can do about it following up. So the IPCC, in addition, provides guidance about how greenhouse gas emissions need to be reported. And as we've heard, due to various decisions made during these negotiations, whilst there is guidance that says military, or at least one aspect of military emissions, military fuel use, can be reported under one of the IPCC categories. It's category 1.A.5, which is other, not otherwise specified. It's not compulsory, it's voluntary. It's not comprehensive because it doesn't take into account all the sources of emission. So we have a lot of absent data, and the data that is provided by the few countries is aggregated. And so we really don't know what's going on. So this is why we have what's called a military emissions. So what's the policy process and how can we fix this gap? Which, as the other speakers have said, we're really focused here on the bottom line. Here is the starting point upon which other activities and advocacy can be based, is to just to get the governments of the world to be reporting comprehensively and in a disaggregated way on their military emissions as part of their annual reporting requirements under the Framework Convention. The Paris Agreement has an instrument called nationally determined contributions. This is where every government has to make a formal statement about what its country's emission reduction efforts are going to be to contribute to global mitigation efforts. Collectively, the world has committed to net zero emissions and to limit global warming to as close to 1.5 degrees possible. And every country has to say what their contributions will be. And these are called naturally determined contributions. And there is an oversight mechanism. It's called the global stocktake every few years. And we're about to get the first major global stocktake, or it could be the second, sorry, where each of the country's individual naturally determined contributions are assessed and they're added up, and an assessment is made of how collectively in aggregate, whether they're on track to achieve net zero emissions and limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. The assessment that was made at the end of last year shows that there's a huge gap between what the science is telling us is needed and what current policies as being implemented are achieving. We're currently on track, if nothing were to change, to not 1.5 degrees by the year 2100, but 3 degrees. Okay, so the pressure is really on at this year's COP and the following COPs for countries to increase their mitigation ambition and to do a better job at implementing their commitments under the naturally determined contribution. The fact that the current US administration has said they're going to withdraw from the Paris Agreement, what that means is at least for another 4 years, we're going to get a big increase in emissions from one of the major emitters. However, the rest of the world remains committed to, the rest of the world community remains committed to the agreement, including the other two major emitters, China and India and EU. And I would add military emissions if we were to treat them as a global sector. So the bottom line is that the Paris Agreement can only be effective if governments are providing comprehensive and transparent national greenhouse gas inventory reports, so that when the global stocktakes occur, we have accurate estimates of the change in total human-caused greenhouse gas emissions, and we know whether we have to ratchet up people's ambitions, whether policies need to be strengthened, and if so, in which area. So the lack of mandatory, comprehensive and transparent accounting and reporting of military emissions is therefore a major concern. It's a major gap and a major impediment to progressing the implementation of the Paris Agreement. However, this can be addressed quite simply, not in a political sense, but in a technical sense, by revisions to the IPCC and related framework convention reporting frameworks and reporting obligations to ensure that they are comprehensive and transparent and disaggregated, as I've been discussing. This requires the parties to the convention at a COP to have a decision which gives direction to the IPCC to revise their guidelines and come back to the parties to the convention with guidance on how to do this. Because at that point, it's a technical matter, and the IPCC is the institution that's set up to provide that kind of technical advice. And I'll just finish. We have one more issue, though, as both previous speakers have said, the conflict emissions from war and violent conflict must also be addressed, because they're not part of what we're talking about, if you like, are the normal military emissions. If you look at the top 20 countries for spending, the 20 countries that spend the most on military, in total, it was about 1.7 trillion in 2023. all that military complex is an activity generates emissions. That's what we're talking about with the IPCC. But the conflict emissions, the emissions that arise from conflict, they're, if you like, currently being treated in an analogous way to international aviation emissions and international shipping emissions. They're ironically called bunker emissions because they're hidden and no one can see them. So conflict emissions really are a bunker emission. No one takes responsibility for them. Tragically and ironically, if you think about it, the current accounting rule is that emissions are the responsibility of the countries where they occur. So, for example, Australia exports a huge amount of coal and natural gas to other countries. We don't account for those emissions. They're accounted for by the countries that burn them. If Australia were to invade New Zealand and drop bombs on New Zealand, all those emissions would be the responsibility of New Zealand.
Of New Zealand.
Under the current accounting rules. Obviously, that's nonsensical. So again, I think that the IPCC would also have to be directed that we would need to have some process by which conflict emissions were also brought into the calculation and the calculus